Hey folks, welcome back. I know it's been on and off recently, but I've been super busy towards the end of the year dealing with a bunch of things and work, but I decided to make sure that if nothing else, I squeezed some time in to get to my top 10 2024 decks. I've been absolutely eating up whatever rendition of this other people have done. Some have done top 5, some have split Tarot and Oracle. Logan of Lark and Legend did 8, I believe. I know that the 3 lovelies from 3 Girls 1 deck are going to do their standouts. There are quite a bunch of approaches. I've decided to share mostly the Tarot and Oracle pairings in my top 10 because actually that's a great reflection of my practice during 2024. With every, say, standout or favourite tarot deck, there's been an oracle or vice versa for the most part. We have 2 exceptions. We also have an honourable mention, but you know, if you put 11 top decks, for some reason it just doesn't go down as well. So we are going to jump right in because there is no need for any more ramble, and let's talk about the first 2. So what I've decided to do is show you the tarot, then the oracle, then I'll show you the pairing at the end, just very briefly as well, because I want to talk about the individual qualities or experience, I guess, of the deck as well. So this is the Forest Lore Tarot, which is an absolute beauty, and really for me, I think that it was such a hit in 2024 because of the local animals. And so I finally had a deck that made sense to me, that really just showcased the British landscape, all things that I'm very familiar with, that remind me of home, that I work with, lots of animal gnosis and goodness to dive into here, some more tree energy, some of which has been more study on my part and learning, but in just the best way. And I just feel like this was a greater craft connection for me, or practice. It's quite an energetically uplifting deck, but also I feel that it's partially because of the visuals, partially because it's more of an animal gnosis focus for me. So I wasn't actually pulling too many at a time alongside the Coastal Curiosities, which is the oracle that I use this with. But this really just, it was something that I felt like I had been waiting for. I was really excited to get a hold of it. It gives me kind of the nostalgia animal vibes that I had when I was really getting into animals when I was young and looking through books and learning about them. You know, the guidebook really just added a lot of value to my experience just because it was done well. I think that at the beginning of the year in particular, which is when I most dominantly use this pairing, I was looking for something quite simple. Not that it can't do the other stuff, but that's certainly what I was enjoying doing with it. Next up, I have the Coastal Curiosities, which was pretty much my main pairing with the Forest Folklore. And I find this deck a really easy, fun one to use. It's quite gentle but neutral in its energy in my experience. Like, there are still some more challenging keywords, but it's got that complementary style, which you'll see when I pair them. And it's just something quirky and fun that, quite honestly, I've said before, this deck feels quite different to me than some of the oracles I had already had. It felt like it added something of which, I don't know, was just adding a bit of flavour, adding a little bit of a delight. It sort of reminds me of finding hidden symbols and the joy of kind of noticing something different about the cards every time, even if you're pulling a repeating card. So I really love that energy about it. Because there are these layers, it is something that I get attracted to a different part every time, and I really love those games. Like I enjoy spot the difference, I enjoy find the hidden items. It's a whole mood, and I've had a lot of fun with this deck, and I have literally paired it with so many other decks. It's unreal. So it definitely feels quite versatile in that sense. And so we couldn't finish off without giving you a little lookie of all of them together. Can you see how complementary the styles are? They've both got these kind of stamp shapes in the background. They utilise colour in sort of similar ways, and yet I don't feel like they're both too busy. The Forest Law feels just a tiny bit more simplistic visually, so there's not too much mess. They're both really conscious in the way that everything is added into the picture. So the symbols mean something, the plants that we're seeing in both of them, they mean something, they represent something. And it's quite funny because, of course, the coast that this represents is not local to me, but does give me some of that other sort of animal connection that perhaps some of them aren't as local to me, but over the years are still animals that I've connected with and studied and been curious about and interested in. So I feel like they play with each other quite well. First half of the year, these were my favourites, and I think some of it was I was looking to have my spirit lifted a little bit. I was using these for very general readings or very selective spreads, usually not huge spreads either. So not as deep dive as some of the other decks, but I think that's why some of these are standouts as well, and favourites for the year, because they provided me with different things at different times throughout the year. And this year, when I was working with decks in pairs, I was predominantly just working with the pair or maybe the trio. I wasn't using as many decks as I usually do outside of sort of client readings. Moving on to our next pair, the first one is the Witch Sister Tarot, and this one was a new to me deck, I want to say this year, because FYI, most of these decks weren't necessarily new to me this year. That's not how I've done it. They're just favourites because they stood out, because they made for an impactful practice, because they were the most used, those kind of things. Initially, I wasn't as drawn to this one as Tarot of the Hidden Realm by the same creator. And whilst they are incredibly different flavours, when you're quite bonded to one, for me at least, it's hard not to have some form of comparison go on initially. And they feel nothing like each other to me now. I have worked with this for probably a solid 3 months. This sort of carried me through the preparation of my move and through the move to our new old place. And it's just been a really lovely, affirming, emotive, witchy, empowering deck. Again, I think that whilst there's a lot of focus in particular on Scotland, and I don't live in Scotland, I live in England, there is enough familiarity, there is enough crossover, whether that's in plants, whether some of the other lore discussed isn't Scotland specific. There is just that familiarity in this deck in particular, and it's actually pleasantly surprised me. It definitely made me eat my words. And I think that it was just learning to read it in the way in which it presents rather than coming at it with a system, which I'm fine doing. But the first time I tried with this deck, I wasn't really in that headspace. And actually, as I really needed something and I really wanted to express some emotions that perhaps I was struggling with as well, this one was a really nice, intense, but nice doorway into that. And we have its pal, the Memento Mori Oracle, which I've spoken about so much that I won't spend too much time on it on its own. People know that I am absolutely in love with this deck. It doesn't really get put away. Obviously, I use it more times than others, but honestly, this deck gets used every month without fail, and it has done the whole of 2024. So, of course, it would be in here. But for those not familiar, I have done a review of this, which is very much a love note to it. On my Patreon, I've also gone through and show how I curate it every time that I do that. I feel like it just really helps with guidance, direction, an extension of what I'm doing. Like you can see, mine is becoming increasingly worn on the edges because it holds up really well actually, because it just, I don't want to say abused because that sounds horrible. The use for this one is just quite a lot. So let's see it with the Witch Sister, because that's where it's been really shining for me this year. And so hopefully, without being too repetitive, I'm just going to say that this feels like a really good reflection of my practice in 2 decks. It's very witchcraft indulgent, witch affirming, wild and rewild encouraging. It's very symbol heavy, but then there's a lot of play of colour in the Witch Sister to balance some of that out and really give me sort of an emotive storyteller. And I find that these contrasts between the 2 artistic styles, just again, they really complement each other. It's also been a really good deity connector for me. The 2 that I have connected with through this that I work with anyway are 𝗕𝗿 and 𝗕𝗏. This one has predominantly been like a second half of the year deck, so I think that it's quite telling as well about how I was feeling, what I wanted, what sort of practice I was diving into, what things were calling me, because this was much more for practice extensions and very emotional readings actually. Some directional ones, so sort of exploring paths and advice, and then also the deity connection. And really, when I say that, what I mean is communicating with devotionals, that kind of approach. They just feel really made for that. It's a very personal thing, but it's definitely one of their like superpowers, I guess, in my practice. I probably should have added that if I had to choose a favourite pairing, I think that the Witch Sister and the Memento would be my favourite pairing out of all of them, because I didn't really do a hierarchy and stuff because it's too much to think about. Next up, we have my absolutely favourite photographic deck. This deck has won prizes in my world, and it is the Somnia Tarot, which is just a deliciously evocative, kind of dark, but in that dreamscape capacity, which if you know the deck, then you know that is entirely infused in its makeup. Like, that was the intention. Somnia, short for insomnia. This speaks to the dreamscape. This speaks to our potentially our nightmares as well, and the things that go boo in the night, you know, that kind of eerie, otherworldly vibe that it just does so well. My only complaint about this deck, genuinely, is that I wish it was a tiny bit smaller, just because of my hands. It's ever so slightly larger than a traditional tarot size, and that does make for gorgeous photography imagery, but my hands. I don't know how to explain why I connected with it so well. It is a aesthetic that I enjoy. It has the right coloration, I guess, to sort of entice me in. It's not over busy despite it being photography. It's kind of melancholy, it's dramatic. It just has a lot of yeses for me. The way that everything's composed, like the posture, all of those things, and sort of moving away from the people being too much of an individual. You know, they are characters and they are there, but they're not taking up too much space. And it does remind me of a dream in that way as well. Like sometimes when you wake up and you can remember the energy of someone or something about them, or perhaps even the name or the hair they had, but they're not quite fully in existence or affirmed or whatever it is. I don't know, it's just obscure enough that it makes my funky little heart tick in a really great way. And I didn't think that the 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗃 would find a way to delight me as much as it has, because there are two very 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗃 decks in this selection. So my pairing buddy for the Somnia Tarot is the Mushroom Oracle, and I have the first 3 in this series, I guess. So I don't have the crystal, but I have the mushroom, the flower, which you'll see later, and also the seashell. I have used both the flower and the mushroom with the Somnia, but in terms of meeting energy like for like, at least in my world, again, this kind of dark, otherworldly fey forest that we've got going on in the mushroom, just again, it brings to mind the word delicious. Like, they are an absolute delicious pairing, and both of them have surprised me, which is why they really stood out as well. I genuinely wasn't expecting that much from the Mushroom Oracle. It has these 3 keywords. Sometimes they feel quite far apart from each other, whereas other times they feel really complementary and similar. That in itself is kind of an interesting contrast between some of the cards to others. The type of collage is something that I enjoy, but there are a few cards that kind of stand out that aren't my favourite. But honestly, for all of the minor, I guess I don't even want to go as far as dislikes, but like, for want of a better term, those minor things has just been outweighed by the actual experience of using it, especially with the Somnia Tarot. I have used it on its own as well, and I do find it to be quite an enjoyable one because of those 3 keywords. Sometimes one just stands out far more than another and feels more relevant. Sometimes I do a lot more what I call like storytelling and story reading in them, and that's based on the visuals, whereas other times it might be more a focus on other aspects, especially when I've used it with the Somnia. But let's see them together. Just look at them. Just enjoy them visually with me. How I worked with these 2 together ended up being very potent. They both sort of evoked what I'll refer to, because it's a familiar sort of phrase, as deeper dives into the tarot in general and its archetypes, but also very self-developmental readings, challenging readings, support readings, a little bit of, I guess, shadow work, a little bit of dream exploration and interpretation aid, because I do just feel that the Somnia in particular is really good for that. Again, this is another one that it has been an interesting one for deity stuff, but only loosely. So just a little bit with Odin. I feel like they lure me into the stories until this discovery occurs. And so sometimes with this pairing in particular, I might pull it and work with it for a bit of a longer time, come back and look at them again, add to my thoughts of them. You know, I keep an Apple Notes journal because it's nice and accessible for me. And it also has this kind of sleep demon, fae lure. That's like, it's almost like they come and grab you and take you into the story, and then you get released at the end of it, but not until you're finished. It's kind of like, I felt really curious with these ones. I would just be with them over the course of days or whatever until we sort of came to a conclusion, or like I said, a discovery. And also one of the things that I noted, which I haven't got to say about the other decks, and it could be a fun tag for another time, but if these combos were to represent a character, they would totally be David Bowie's character in the Labyrinth. I say that because people are more probably familiar if I say David Bowie than if I say his character's name, but this is the vibes that these 2 give me, you know, so I don't necessarily want to use them all the time the whole year through. I'm sure they can read for other things, but that's kind of where I'm at with them. So the next pairing, of which we're seeing the tarot, and it is the Antique Anatomy Tarot Ephemera edition, and this one is the mass market in particular because it was the first one that I grabbed. I interchange them for myself, although this is the one that I use for clients. They're definitely a standout together this year in particular, like a favourite because of what happened with the pairings. So I don't have too much to say about them individually that I haven't already. But just to recap, this has been a favourite and a standout many a time before, purely because it's my aesthetic and because it makes a lot of sense to me. One of the things I would say about the Antique Anatomy in particular, it really allows me to get into my intuitive and numerological reading style. Now, my reading style exists in sort of, I guess, a flexible flux, and so there are layers to reading the imagery, there are layers to intuition, there are layers to the various structures, schools of thought and things like that I bring to them, and depending on the deck, depends on how much of that there is, or, you know, what sort of approach I guess I'm going for. So this is definitely one that I find the numerology really sings for me, and the elemental stuff, and I get to bring in a little bit of the colour as well, which I will speak to more. But it's a very reliable reader, this one in particular. It's been a go-to for a long time. It just has that kind of spacious energy about it without failing to offer something. You know, it doesn't feel empty or without, it feels very intentional, which certainly is a theme in a lot of the decks that I've chosen this year. And so, as I said before, not only were we seeing the mushroom, but we were seeing the flower oracle, which I also did use briefly with the Somnia. And much to my surprise, it actually worked really well still. I can't explain it. Things work for us. We don't always have reasons. It's more of an energetic exchange a lot of the time, and sometimes it takes me a while to find words to be able to even share that with you on YouTube. So yeah, I'm not gonna make more of it than it was. It just clicked. But this really shines when it gets paired with the Antique Anatomy Tarot. And as far as what I've said about the mushroom oracle, it kind of rings true with the flower as well in terms of the 3 keywords and what I've said about the artwork. So I don't want to repeat myself too much, other than to say the overall energy of the deck, of course, is different. The flowers are a little bit more gentle, not fully, but more so, a bit more springy as well. Like, I associate this with spring, whereas I associate the mushroom one with autumn. So definitely a seasonal facet there. And so together, what I was finding with these two is that more often than not, some really interesting colour work was coming through, and folks will know that colour work is something that I really enjoy. I haven't done a video on it, but more so because it's quite fluid how I approach it, and it would be easier just to do a reading where that might be incorporated. I couldn't really sit down and discuss it in a way where others might sort of take notes and learn from it, I guess, or utilise it in the same way that I did the numerology video with Dawn, because it's just not as, I guess, hard and fast or structured as that. And even that in itself has some fluidity, but the colour stuff in particular, you know, it's not just one set emotion or feeling or message per colour. There's several of them, and then it depends on what else is coming through, what I've asked, all of those layers. But I did really notice it, and of course there are flowers throughout this deck, so I went in knowing that those two would probably work together quite well, just in terms of like a floral aesthetic. Otherwise they look nothing like each other, which again, you might notice that from a lot of my combos. They're more energetically fitting to each other than they are sort of aesthetically, but I think that that's made a huge difference, to be honest. I enjoy both, but it's very much been more this way. And so with this beautiful imagery, it has been really meaningful. I have got the versatility of this one with the words to see what comes up with here. Simplistic meets expansive potential. And I think that the reason, look at these two together, see? Don't mind me, I'm just getting lost in it. I was like, do I do a reading? No, there's no time. These are really good for testing spreads because I create a lot of spreads. And also if anyone else is sharing a spread or I've bought something that has spreads in, I like to test them out nowadays with something that's quite a nice, simple and quick, accessible read to see if the spread feels like a good fit for me. This is great for daily vibes. Now, I don't pull cards every day without fail, but I do sporadically do daily readings, if that makes sense. And I really enjoyed it for that. And I did just feel like for something that could be to the point and quicker, that I could come back and reflect on later and pull out some of the colours and the symbology, but also it's not like a necessity to the reading. I really enjoyed that. I think this is where it shone for me, and I noticed that a lot of the time I would do the readings in the morning with this one and then I would come back to it in the evening, and that was quite a fun process in itself. I just really have a moment with it, and I'm really curious what other people think about these two together, just looking at them like this, because perhaps it doesn't make sense to you, but honestly, it's just been so good. They just, again, pleasantly surprised me, but what you'll see is that each of these pairings has really served a different purpose or showed up for a different season for me throughout the year. So the last two of the 10 didn't get used together, so I won't show them together. I mean, I don't know if they would work well together, but I've used them for very different things. So this is the Little Pigeon Tarot. And if you've been on my channel at all in the last 4 or 5 months, you will have heard the absolute love affair that I have been having with this glorious tarot deck. I don't know what else to say because I don't want to bore the people who have already been watching my stuff. There's an interesting discussion in tarot land, let's talk about that instead, where do we often find ourselves sort of chasing down a deck that just doesn't exist and keep trying a new one. But in terms of flavour, I think that we can have decks that show up that are just right for us. And I'm sorry if some people are watching and they haven't had that yet. A long time ago now, Kelly from The Truth in Story did a tag, something along the lines of like pieces of our soul. The way it was phrased was really good because it wasn't that a soul deck was just this one deck that you had to find, and it was like the golden chalice or whatever, you know, insert thing that's prized. But it was more that different decks spoke to those different facets. And I think in that I have found a lot of really, or a decent handful of really treasured decks that I have these strong bonds with. And this Pigeon one is just that. It selfishly feels like it was made for me, even though it wasn't. It's got one of my absolute favourite animal kin in the world in it. And that's what makes it a deck of my dreams. Also, the other facets, which are very aesthetic, but that's okay, is that it's gloriously cute and it captures those city pigeon vibes really well in this sort of, I want to say comic book way, but its cuteness still has a grungy aesthetic. And that's a winner with me because I'm not really that cute. It, again, is one of those really Rider-Waite Smith decks without losing its own personality. It's a very trusted reader. Again, it was a very quick reader and I bonded with it incredibly fast, probably because of all of those things. It has been paired with so many other decks that would be a video in and of itself. And I don't know if that's just my relationship with it or maybe the general colour aesthetic and vibes that I go for. And also, I do feel like this one has still pulled punches and it's been very reliable and a go-to for most styles of reading, like a nice all-rounder for me. So I need to stop because I'll make this too long. But I love Little Pigeon Tarot and it is one of my favourite decks of the whole year and possibly my collection. So we've got official deck 10 and then we've got the honourable mention, and the way that I worked out which was which, because I am just going to show the other one in the same way because I make the rules here on my channel, is that this one got used more. And this is the Woodland Wardens Oracle. That's right, yeah. I don't know why I find that to be a mouthful. And as someone who works with animals, lots and lots and lots, especially because it's such a significant part of several of the offerings I now do over on my Patreon, animal decks are kind of useful. And when I get on with the visuals, especially because I don't always use this as an oracle in the traditional way. Like, sometimes this is just representing the animal that I have chosen. I might not have even shuffled a deck and pulled the animal that way. Sometimes the animal gnosis is to do with an animal that started cropping up in my life, and I'm like, okay, well, we're going to work with you, all of us as a collective. Bring my Patreons along for the ride. I was going to say whether they like it or not, but I'm assuming they do because they're still there. Sometimes dreams, sometimes it feels really fitting with something else that I already have planned for that month. Like, it really is, again, quite fluid, quite flexible. Maybe they are keywords for my year on reflection. I love the aesthetic. I love having it out on my altar. And if I do want to use it as an oracle, I enjoy the keyword selection. I think it's a really solid keyword selection. And it also adds the layer of plants, which to me is secondary because of my practice and focus, but still very much included and important. And I get to think about them, perhaps learn a little something about them. It isn't a perfect deck for me. I have gripes with the book. I actually found some incorrect animal information in there. It was one card, but I think I had hoped for a lot more lore than what was in the book. However, I don't think that that in any way makes it a bad deck. It's still a solid book offering that pulls the plant and the animal together really well, and for the most part very consciously. It makes sense. It's not too much information, and I think for people who aren't necessarily looking to learn all of the things about the animal and plant, just want a bit of information, are going to love this even more. So it's been a really sturdy reader. I'd love to see her make an animal deck with this style to it as well, like a tarot, sorry. But that's because I'm greedy. I'm greedy for animal tarot decks as well. But it is beautiful, and I can't deny that I have used it a lot for its imagery, for inspiration and stuff throughout the year, even though sometimes that inspiration has nothing to do with the keyword, and it definitely doesn't have anything to do with the guidebook. But yeah, it's a fun one. I am sure that I'm going to do the same thing with it next year, and perhaps use it as an oracle just a little bit more as well. And finally, we have the honourable mention. Thank you for sticking with me. We have secret number 11. It wasn't a secret, was it? Not at all. And this is a mega deck, in my world anyway, because it's a combination of two. So you could say it's cheating even further, but I don't separate them. So this is the Hedgewitch Botanical Oracle and the Winterseer Animal Oracle. So same creator, two different decks, same cardstock, at least in my copies, same style, same size, meshed together beautifully. And so I did actually use this one with the Witch Sister Oracle before the Memento Mori came and kicked it. It kicked it to the curb. The three of them work really well together as well, so there is that, but I wasn't about to make my life more confusing. It's got a really big shadow because of the lighting, but we can live with it. I freaking love the artwork on this, and again, I think that there's some really lovely keywords, thoughtfully done. The books are great. I've done a video on this, by the by, the two decks together, and I speak about both the books. So if you're interested, check that out, because that's where I really get into it. What I love about these as well, other than the fact that plants and animals, again, it's a thing. I enjoy it. It's a big part of my practice. They go with quite a lot of my decks, especially ones that perhaps the Woodland Wardens doesn't feel as fitting. And I love that I don't know whether I'm going to get an animal or a plant, especially when I'm only pulling the one. So it's kind of fun. Obviously the backs are different. They're very different. So you kind of just don't look at what you're doing when you're shuffling, just enough. if that makes sense. But it does work wonderfully, and this has been a great one to actually sit down and read the guidebook. I've really enjoyed that with it. It's not the only way I've used it, but especially when I wanted to do a review about it so quickly, I had to read both of the guidebooks because I take my reviews very seriously and I wanted all of the information. They're so good. There are some repeat keywords and I get into that in that video, but I don't mind. And here you go, patience and patience. If I pull both of them, I can get nuances of my own accord, especially because patience definitely isn't the only thing for me that comes up with heron. Whereas I don't actually know that much about trout lily, and I'm far more likely to use the guidebook for the plants, whereas I don't really need it for the animals. So I've read it, it's great, but I don't really use it. However, I think as well, if it comes up, perhaps they might be in two different positions, or perhaps it just really reinforces, like, chick, you need some patience, like, work on this. I just love that. But as I say, I do use the book for this one a hell of a lot more as well. And I didn't want to leave it out because I really loved it with the Witch Sister. I can't really work out why. Perhaps I'm just going to show it to you really quickly. I guess in truth, this is as much a reflection of my practice as the other two are. But instead of being really focused on witchcraft and the tools, we've got the expansion of the animals and the plants very focused in. And there's obviously keywords on this one, so that's a nice way to bounce off of things. But I think it does it every time. See, it had to be shown together. Two of Waters, duality. And what I was literally just about to say, either there's a really strong colour pull between them, or something else really synchronistic just jumps out at me at points. I'm sure it hasn't happened with all of them, but honestly, like, when I actually pull from it, it happens every time without fail. It has just been so good. Nine of Stones, build with 𝗕𝗏𝗃. And again, the colours, I just love it. Ooh, Page of Water. At Waters with weave. Oh, I like the idea of that. Weave and spider for me are very intuitive energies anyway. So not a colour one there, but definitely energetically. I love that boar has come up, and also in this deck, stones, which are pentacles, the boar is actually in this suit on the 4 of stones, I believe. And again, look at the colour play between them. And she just looks so fierce, so ready, so brave. As I pull this, we've been working with boar on Patreon as well, so I will stop there. But that is my 10, 11 top decks of 2024. I really hope that you've enjoyed this. I hope it was fun. If there are ones that I haven't reviewed that you would like to see in 2025, please let me know. Whilst I pretty much do what I want and show up when I can on YouTube, because why wouldn't I? But also, you know, the health conditions, all of the other things that I have going on. And so I have plans and sometimes I can't get to all of them. I would love to hear from you if you have anything that you'd really love to see from me in 2025. That would be fun to hear. Otherwise, I hope the end of this year treats you as gently as it can. Honestly, for me, it has been one of the hardest years I have ever had. And whilst I'm not like, oh, new year, new me, I am very excited to perhaps feel a shift in 2025. I am definitely ready for that transition, which I'm feeling already. So yeah, here's to these wonderful decks though. Thank you for hanging out with me this year, and I hope to see you in the new year. Bye.